George, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We're catching you at home in Los Angeles, I take it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, well, it's great to be in touch. And the reason that we're doing this interview is to find out about your background. Your name is associated with some phenomenal recordings as someone who actually participated in them personally. And then also, just in terms of your record label, Resonance Records, which is issued some of the most important historic issues of the last decade plus. I'll just mention names like Bill Evans and Sonny Rollins and Grant Green and Nat King Cole and Thad Jones and Mel Lewis, which of course I assume we'll talk about at length because you actually engineered those recordings. Wes Montgomery, I've just named a few, but
yes.
And so I'd like to find out how this happened. So can we start with where and when were you born?
I was born in Manhattan, April 3rd, 1946, and my first experience with jazz was when I would visit my father. My father was divorced from my mother when I was 4, and he was born in Brazil, and his side of the family all lived in Brazil. They emigrated from Lithuania, so he was first generation Brazilian. Anyway, I would go down. He had custody of me in the summers here, which is winters in Brazil, and I would. He had given me some. When I was about 6 or 7, he gave me an old wind-up Victrola because they had upgraded to LPs and a modern system, and he gave me a bunch of 78 RPMs, and I was playing them very happily, and among them there was Slap That Bass, which is on the reverse side of They All Laughed, the film. I don't know the name of the film with Fred Astaire. Maybe you.
Shall We Dance, I think.
Okay, Shall We Dance? Yes. So I was fascinated that an instrument could sound like that, a bass and so on. And eventually I went downstairs to maybe a couple of years later, but I would come every summer. And there was a Victrola there, LP. There were some LPs, and there was a LP of Albert Ammons, a 10-inch LP. Albert Ammons playing Boogie Woogie. I put that on, and I said, "Man, this is terrific stuff. I love it." And there was an Oscar Peterson Sings on clef. That was a 10-inch recording that he had made in 1950. So I would listen to that, and of course that was jazz, and that's really how I got started.
Sure. Was music something for you also that you were going to be playing music? Was there music in school? Was there a piano around? Was there anything?
No, the only thing, well, yes, when I was about, I think I was about 8, and I told my mother I'd like to learn to play the piano because I thought that if you took lessons, you would learn to play the piano. It sounded logical. Doesn't work like that. So I took some lessons and realized very quickly that I had to learn how to read music, which I didn't particularly like. So I did a little of it, and I had to learn how to hold my hands, et cetera, et cetera. And after a few lessons, I was not interested. And I didn't want to practice and so on. So that went by the wayside. So that was my musical playing experience at that point.
All right. So you're born in 46. So
Yep.
That means that as a young teenager, it's the late 50s, it's the early 60s. The Beatles come over, but even before that.
Oh, before that, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So where was popular music as you encountered it, and what did you and your friends listen to, and when did was it jazz that you would consider yourself an aficionado so young?
Yes, it was. I started listening seriously to jazz in sometime around 1959, 1960. I'd say 1959, when I was 13. And before that, I was listening to Boogie Woogie, and I would go down to the stores. I guess I was about 11 or 12, and buy the cutout old. They had stacks of 78s. They would almost give them away because of the LP being the big means of delivering music. So I bought some, and I was playing them and enjoying them. And then I started buying jazz at Sam Goody's, a store that was quite famous back then. And I would go down there once a month, and I would see what new releases they had. They didn't let me play them, so I'd have to take a shot and buy them. And and take them home. And so I started with modern jazz. My first love was Errol Garner, and that would have been the beginning of real modern jazz for me. And after that, I started collecting Oscar Peterson, and then I went to Bill Evans, which to me was, by then I was probably 14 or 15. And I loved the three sounds, and that kind of jazz, blues-oriented, funky jazz as well. So that was my beginning.
You know, it's interesting when we hear names like that tossed around now. The three sounds were new.
Hmm.
Bill Evans was absolutely new and fresh, and I think, you know, for a lot of the folks who come into it through the reissues or through the new issues, they're missing that kind of feeling that you lived through when it
Yeah.
was a new record and you
Yes.
hadn't
Yes.
heard it before.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, I was all new, and then I think the first thing I did that was well, I was in high school. I went to a prep school, which is a
Hmm.
boarding school in Connecticut, and I think it was my third year there. I asked whether I could bring in jazz group from New York that I had heard. In other words, students were often allowed to arrange that kind of situation. The school paid for it, but they wanted to bring in music. So they did bring in a guy named Howard Reynolds, who was at that time a very talented pianist. He used to play at on 52nd Street at the let's see, I can't remember. It wasn't the Embers. There was another one, Hickory House, at the Hickory House, which was a steakhouse, and they had jazz. Did you ever see photos of that? Are you familiar
Oh
with that
yes,
place?
very very famous place. Marion McPartland and Billy Taylor and
Yes,
all
yes,
kinds of people played there.
yeah.
And it was a real cushy gig, I think.
Yeah, because you were up in the center on the bar. You climbed upstairs, and there was a whole center part of the bar with the piano, bass, and drums. So it was very interesting the way they did it. Up high, everybody could see. Good sound. Yeah, so Howard Reynolds was a musician that I sort of befriended. I mean, I was all of 15 probably, but and I said I got him a gig, and he came in and played. So that was my beginning of any kind of entrepreneur dealing with jazz in that area, shall we say? Uh, and well, you want
Can
to?
you tell us about some of the other uh, like the first jazz you heard in person? Some memories of some of the earliest musicians that you actually got to hear,
I
apart from
think the
listening to
first
records.
was probably Dorothy Donegan.
Hmm.
I really liked her too. Dorothy Donegan, the jazz pianist, used to play at the Embers, and I
Yeah.
think that was the first time I heard live jazz was at the Embers. And she would, yeah, play a lot of the kind of music like TNT, which was one of those pieces that she did. A lot of boogie, blues,
Hmm.
modern jazz in that aspect, and I really liked it. I mean, I was a kid, and to me that was exciting and very
Sure.
well done. And then
Yeah.
I went on to hear, like, at the Hickory House, various pianists there, and
Hmm.
I collected a lot of piano jazz. That was my favorite piano
Hmm.
jazz. So
As we continue towards, you know,
yeah,
you're actually getting behind a console and recording things and being involved with the music. How did that happen? How did you emerge from just a kid with a great record collection to someone who's actually involved in the music
well,
business?
my last year in high school, there was a station that I got from Boston that did all jazz, and I was at night I would put it on while I was laying in bed and listen to the jazz program often. And I heard Roger Kellaway, who had a brand new record out for the very first time. Roger was about, let's see, 1963, so he was, in his 20s,
Hmm.
early 20s, and I started to, want to be a DJ. I said to myself, I love this idea of playing jazz for people. And I went to Columbia University
Hmm.
the next year, and I went right up to the radio station and told them that I wanted to have a jazz show. And I said, "Who's doing your jazz?" And they said, "Well, actually, the guy who's doing it just graduated, so we don't have anyone." So I said, "So are you playing jazz?" And they said, "We need jazz. We don't have anyone. We'll certainly consider you." and they put me on their AM station. They had a local AM station that only broadcasted to the college itself, so that the guy who was the head, the gentleman that was the head, well, he was a student of this radio station, could hear me. So I did a bunch of very nice programs. I put together, I was allowed to use the studio. I put together a show on bebop, the history of bebop. I had a lot of 78s. I had the very first bebop record. I bought it at a store on Rainbow. It was with Coleman Hawkins. You
Yeah,
know the one
sure.
I'm right. I had
Yes.
that, and I had the very first ever bebop solo, Sepia and Bounce, Charlie Parker on Decca. I got both of those from one store in New York, where the guy had so many, stacks and stacks of 78s, and I think I paid $1 each. And actually, he helped me find them. I said, "Do you happen to have these?" I had been reading about them in the history book of jazz, and he said, "Yeah, look over there." Couldn't believe it. I found them in mint condition.
Good Lord.
And the guy, just as an aside, you can cut this out. The guy, his name was Meltzer, and he was an old guy by that time. He was, I mean, to me, he was very old. He was in his 60s, and he was behind the counter. It was his store, and I said to him, "What else do you have?" He says, "Well, here, look, here's the RCA Victor 78 RPM catalog, which was published probably last in the 50s, And he says, name any recording, name any number, catalog number, and I'll tell you what it is." He had memorized the entire catalog, and I was testing him, and he was perfect, like knowing the phone book. I don't know who the owner was. I never met him. You walk up in this old creaky old building. You walk up some stairs and you go into this huge room. It's dark, funky, and the smell of the perfume of the guy there was this big fat guy who took care of it. And I think he was an American Indian.
Hmm.
He looked like a native Indian. And
Hmm.
he was a very nice guy. And his job was just to make sure nobody stole anything. And there were
Hmm.
all these bins alphabetically, and it was
Hmm.
really funky. And it was LP. So I said, "Do you have any 78s?" Just out of curiosity. He said, "Look over here in that room." There was a room stacked with 78s. And still, like you could have them almost. I wasn't buying them anymore at that point.
So you're at WKCR. You're
Yeah,
doing
I'll
that
go
show
back.
on
I'll go
AM.
back. I'll do this straight. Otherwise, we'll be here for 6 hours. So
No, it's okay.
anyway, so what I did is I did some really good shows. I taped them. I put them together in the control room with, play. I had an engineer. I emceed it. I did it all so he could hear me. And then I played it on the air, and he listened to maybe 2 shows, and he went, "You're hired. You're really
Hmm.
good." Because I
Hmm.
mean, it was well done, I must say.
Hmm.
So I started on the air on Sunday nights from 9 to midnight. I called it Jazz Till Midnight, and it was
Hmm.
every Sunday. And
Hmm.
what I did is I started playing records, and I had access to their library, which was good. And new releases came in; they were serviced, and so I would see the
Hmm.
new releases, and I learned a lot because I mean, as much jazz as I knew was nothing compared to what I know later. So,
Hmm.
like Monty Alexander's first record came in, Pacific Jazz and stuff like that when I was there. And I really loved Monty Alexander. I have a friendship with him and so on. So, bottom line is, I'm thinking like this: how can I get people to listen to my show? It was very proactive and sort of like already thinking of ways to get more listeners. And I had a huge potential listening audience of 3 states because it's
Two
50,000
questions for you.
watts.
What
Yeah.
year is this, George? This is
Okay, we're
six.
now talking 1960, 65, early
Okay.
65, and
And this
and
is
this
KCR FM. But
that's right. 50,000 watt stereo out of Ferris Booth Hall, which was torn down later and then rebuilt and
Mhm.
so on. So what I did is I said, if I could bring original recordings that have never been heard, that I make of
Mhm.
musicians that are really good, people will tune in to hear that and they'll listen to my show. And of course, because in those days you weren't allowed to play anything on a commercial station that wasn't licensed, like put out on a record label, but because we were on an educational station, I could do that.
Mhm.
So all I had to do was get permission of the musician. So the first person I called in December of 1964, because I wasn't, I guess I actually got on the air right around then. So maybe, late 64 was Roger Kellaway. I
Mhm.
located him. I found where he was in New York. I called him up, introduced myself, and said I would like to give you a recording, which you can bring. You can bring in a bass and drums, and it's a great, it's a great Steinway concert grand piano on the stage, and so on and so forth. And then we'll record you, and you'll allow me to play it once. I give you a copy, and you can do whatever you want with it. No, who's going to turn down a deal like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he comes in with Dave Bailey and Russell George in December, and I did not know exactly how to record at that level. So I did not have a tape recorder yet. What I did is I used, because the radio station actually had a window that you could see the auditorium, because it was a floor above, and it was so that you could record concerts. They had set that all up, they had all the wiring. So I just plugged two RCA 77s into outlets there on the stage, and a guy upstairs recorded it for me. I checked the mix and so on. But so I was really recording with just two mics, and the recording was not bad, but it wasn't great. It was good enough you could hear everything clearly, and so on. And that was my beginning. But then after I listened back to it, I was disappointed. Being that I'm a person who always wanted better quality, I said, you know what, this isn't going to work. I'm going to have to buy my own equipment. I'm going to have to figure out how to record properly, and I'm going to do that so that I can make better quality recordings. So sometime in early '65, I bought this really good Crown tape recorder, which is a super professional. It's a professional machine that wasn't used in studios. It would be the consumer professional, that goes out on the road. This machine was in every bit as good as the Ampex machines that were out there professionally. And I bought a bunch of mics, 6 mics, including a Neumann 67, and very good mics, Bayer, German mics. I paid the price.
Mm-hmm.
And some headphones and an Ampex mixer. I could then have 6 inputs total. And I went out and I started recording. Well, I started calling up other musicians and asking if they would like to come. And I started to get a reputation. After about a year of this, the talk was out. Hey, this guy Klabin will record you for free. You pay him for the tape, and he does it, records you for free. And then you get a copy, which you can use, and he puts it on the air too. And sometimes I would even interview the people. So it started to get really, it started to become a thing. And meanwhile, I was having such a good time with my radio show. They gave me another show. I had a show on Wednesdays or something called The New Jazz, and it was all avant-garde jazz, which I didn't really like. But Bernard Stallman called me up in 1965 and said, look, I have this whole new record label, ESP, and we want you to play this on the air. This is a whole new wave in music. Do you remember the October Revolution? Did you ever hear about that in New York?
Yes, but tell our listeners about it who might not know what it is.
Right, I am going to. So the October Revolution was exactly when I arrived as a freshman. It started in October of 1964, and I arrived at college late September. So I was curious about it, and this is before I was on the air. As I said, I was still, trying out. But I went to these various locations where they were recording and where they were performing, and one was called the West Side Cafe, which was located walking distance from the college. So I went there to hear, I can't remember who, I think Rashid Ali was the drummer. I can't remember.
Is this the West End?
Yeah, the West End Cafe.
Right.
Which is on 100 and something street.
112th, 113th. I played there many, many times. Yes.
Well, yeah, it's
place.
Okay, so I think that's the place. It was something like that. Anyway, so the best thing that came out of that was while I was there was a guy recording it with a little Ampex portable recorder. And I said, hi, what's going on here? He said, we're being paid. I work for Jerry Newman. We're being paid to record this by these musicians. They want a record of this, and this. So I said, Jerry Newman, I've heard of him. He's famous. Isn't he the guy that recorded Bird and gave away the discs? He said, that's him. So I said, can I get his phone number? So I ended up becoming very friendly with Jerry Newman. And Jerry Newman and I would go to his studio, and he would play me all these great recordings he had. He had recordings from Minton's in the 40s. You probably know this. This is history, right? I'm not telling you anything new, am I?
No, but I just want to interject for our listeners here because
Yes.
Maybe many of them have heard them. These are the recordings of Thelonious Monk and
Yes.
Charlie Christian and Don Byas and Dizzy Gillespie and Kenny Clark and
Sarah
all
Vaughan,
those wonderful,
Ray Brown.
right?
Yep. all
All
of them in
those
their
records.
20s, 20-year-old
Right.
people, 20. So
Yeah.
on there is a recording. There's a recording of Monk playing Epistrophe in Teddy Wilson style. Totally Teddy. You wouldn't know it was Monk. You say, oh, Teddy Wilson playing Monk's tune, Epistrophe. It was incredible. So he hadn't even
Yeah.
developed his style yet. Yeah.
What was your take on him and what he did? And
Jerry Newman was a very cautious person. He obviously had some kind of trauma, and he was polite, he was friendly, he wasn't very warm, only because I think he was, as I said, I think he was not a happy person. And I'll tell you in a minute why, the proof of the pudding of that. So, but he was very nice to me. I'm a young kid. I love jazz. You know, I have a radio show. So what he did is he made up a tape for me of selections of all this, what we just mentioned. And he put tones on top. Every minute you would hear a brief tone that would sort of interrupt it. And he said, be sure you tell your listeners that these are very valuable recordings and we can't have them copied and bootlegged, because even in those days that could happen. So I put it on the air, I explained it, and I still have the original reel with all of those on it. And basically, Jerry Newman was trying to make a living, you know, recording, and he only had 2-track. That's all that really was very common in those days, 2-track stereo. He had a very nice piano in a room, and he would record records for Savoy or whoever, you know, small groups and so on. Unfortunately, and there's a sad ending, not that many years after I met him, and you could look it up, I don't remember, I heard, because I had not dealt with him for a while, that he committed suicide.
oh.
So it was very sad.
Where
Um,
did he live, Jerry? Was it up by Columbia? I mean, George, pardon me. Where did
yeah.
Jerry live?
First of all, I don't know. I never saw his apartment. His studio
Oh,
was a studio. It was a
his
real
studio.
studio. He rented space for it. Yeah, it was a real
I see.
studio, and it was on 22nd Street. And it was weird because I used to walk there, and it's way on the east side, way over like on Avenue A or something. And I would walk by this Italian restaurant, and it smelled so good. One day I went in, it was Sicilian, and I would eat there. And the reason that's so funny is 10 years later, I was dating a girl named Dee Dee Lombardo, and her aunt ran the restaurant. So we'd go to that same restaurant and have great Sicilian food. I mean, it's just incredible when you think how big New York is, you
Yeah.
know. Uh, all right,
I'm going to
so
take it back to the point that your word is getting around about you, that they'll get a
yeah, so
great
anyway,
tape.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sorry, but you know, I go off. I have a lot of stories.
Don't apologize. This is perfect.
Good.
Please.
So anyway, here I am with my own recording equipment and really doing a good job. So somewhere along the line, let's see, couple of major recordings that I did that would be important for people to know. There's a recording I made in 19 at this auditorium. You know, this is where people would come, of Keith Jarrett. What happened was George Avakian got a hold of me through this whole grapevine of people who said, I guess what he wanted, he told me, I have this young pianist, he's playing with Charles Lloyd, his name is, and he was, the pianist, Keith Jarrett, I think was 21 years old at this point, 67, I think, or this might have been 68. He was 1 year older than I was. I think I was 20 and he was 21, etc. So I have this pianist. We want to get him a record deal. I need a good recording. I understand that you would do this recording at no charge and we would allow you to play it one time on your radio station. And I said, absolutely. I had no idea who Keith Jarrett was. I had heard of Charles Lloyd, but I hadn't really played any of his records. So in comes a trio of Paul Modian and um, you're going to have to edit this. I can't remember the name of the bass player. He's very famous. He passed away. The one, I have a blank with this guy. Charlie Hayden. Hey, I remembered. Charlie Hayden, Paul Modian. Again, I've never even heard of them yet. Maybe vaguely, because there's a lot of jazz, and I'm only in it for like a couple of years so far. You know, really in it. So they come in and we set up drums, bass, piano. I had my mics, mic'd everything, and I'm listening through my earphones because obviously I'm on stage. There's no speakers. I'm listening through my earphones, recording this live to 2-track, and I just am going crazy. Oh my God, this guy has reinvented the piano. I've never heard modern jazz played like this. This is a new style. I was just raving about it. So anyway, we recorded, I think, 5 tunes, including several originals. In fact, they were all originals, I believe. And um, then I gave him a copy and thanked him. And I don't even remember if I played it on the air or not, because not that long after, maybe a few days later, I get another call from Avakian's office saying, "You did a really good job, but we need more material. Can you go to the Vanguard next week or whatever, sometime soon? He's booked there for a night, and would you set up?" So that was I think that was the first time I ever recorded at the Vanguard. I brought my stuff down there, set it up on a cocktail table. You're familiar with the Vanguard. It still looks exactly the same the last time I was there, which is mind-boggling. We're
Hmm.
talking, we're talking 50 years, more than that, right? More than 50 years.
Hmm.
So I set up at the cocktail table along the wall up near the front, and I'm recording. Let's see, it was Ron McClure, Paul Modian, and Keith. And Keith is doing some beautiful stuff on the piano. He also played recorder and soprano. I'm not going to comment on that, but you could see that did not come, did that not get released very often. That it was piano was the thing for him. So I have all of these recordings. They all got copies. It's never been released, of course. I would sign an agreement that said, with every artist, I have no rights to release this without permission. I'm only allowed to play it once. I don't even remember if I played it. I'm pretty sure I did once back then on my show. And what's so important about it is that these recordings are extremely well recorded and very, very important in a historical sense, because they really are the earliest known, really high quality recordings of him before he signed a record deal with Vortex and made his first record called Between the Exit Signs. Was that right? Is that the first one he made? I think.
I believe, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. Which was, Vortex was a small offshoot of Atlantic Records. So I
Life,
have what?
life between the exit signs. Yes.
Right, life. Now I have these recordings, and someday I would love to get them out.
Man, these are so important because he's such a
Yeah,
major
yeah.
artist. But I hope
And
someday they see the light of day.
I hope so, because one of the tunes I couldn't find a recording of it. So if that comes out, that would be the very first time that this tune, which was written back then, was ever heard
Hmm.
by anyone. So we'll see.
Hmm.
But then, then I befriended Helen Keane, because I gave a concert. I put a concert together at Columbia with Freddie Hubbard and Sheila Jordan. She was managing Sheila Jordan, so she became friendly with me. And she said, "I manage Bill Evans." And I said, "Oh, I know. Yes, that's a marvelous artist." And then something really interesting happened. Again, very important, was I was hanging out at Bell Sound. You remember hearing about a recording studios called Bell Sound in the
I've heard of
'60s?
it, but again, please tell our listeners why it was
Okay,
important. Or
Bell Sound was one of the 3 or 4 largest and best known recording studios in the '60s in New York. And the owner of ESP, Bernard Stolman, would record there. So I went there once because I was taking photos. I was also an amateur photographer just for fun. I took photos of a guy named Lowell Davidson, who was a pianist who made a record there. And actually, they ended up using the photos on the cover, whatever. But while I was there, everybody left, the session was over, and I was hanging around with the engineer, whose name was Art Christ. And basically, he told me that he had made a recording of Don Friedman with Pete LaRocca and Scott LaFaro in 1961, not long before Scott LaFaro passed. And he said, "Would you like a copy of it? Maybe you could play this on the air." So I said, "Absolutely." So he gives me a copy, and I go home and I listen to it, and it's extremely well recorded in a studio. It's great music, and I'm thinking, you know what? I knew about Scott LaFaro from knowing about Bill Evans, and I said, I'm going to do a tribute. So I put together a tribute show to Scott LaFaro, and I called up Bill Evans' manager, Helen Keane, and said, "Would you allow Bill to come down when he gets a few minutes to come down here to the studio, and I want to interview him?" So that happened, and that was very nice. And then I called Don Friedman, and I asked him, and he gave me a nice interview. And then I put it all together, and put the show on. And many, many decades later, it was released originally in Japan for a while as a license, and then that was over. And it was all Friedman. I worked with Friedman to get who got paid and so on. And then, of course, uh, later we put it out on our label. And it's a really very rare, because there are really so few recordings of Scott LaFaro of any nature that and certainly that hadn't been released. I can't find another one. So
Yeah,
so
that's
those are
right.
the kinds of things that happen to me, or I would make them happen, I guess, by being around. I was so much involved in jazz by that time. So what happened was I had this reputation. People would call me, and then they start paying me. And I think they pay me like $50 plus tape. That was a lot of money. $50 was about a third of my monthly rent. So I'm not complaining about that. Um, and and so then Alan Grant was a DJ on WABC FM's jazz shows. He and I were friendly. He calls me one day, and this is like early 1966, and he says to me, George, this wonderful big band is rehearsing to start playing on Monday nights at the Vanguard. It contains all the greatest musicians in New York, jazz musicians, all these great studio musicians, people who just want to have some fun. And Thad Jones is writing all new arrangements and even some new tunes. And it's got Hank Jones and Mel Lewis, and it's going to be called the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Big Band. Eddie Daniels was in it. You name it. Brookmeyer, just name the royalty of jazz in those days. Every single player was at that level. So he said, would you be kind enough to go down there and record it? Because they want to get a record deal once again, right? So I said, why not? I never heard the band. I was still somewhat of a novice in some senses of the word, because I didn't have a studio, and I didn't have a lot of these guys in my studio. So I knew of them, and some of them I'd heard, but this was all very new. And I'm 19 years old. So I go there and I set up in the same position again, a little coffee table. I mean, I call it a coffee table. It was tiny. It was a table for two. At the very front, in the back, the back of the there's a row of those tables, and I was at the front of the stage. Said all I had was a mixer, 6 mics, headphones, and the mixer and the tape recorder.
Did you have
And
an assistant or anybody
I
helping you?
had Zilcho. I had to carry all the stuff in. I had to set it all up. That thing weighed 70 pounds, that tape recorder. I'm lucky I was young, because I was lugging that thing, and I had a whole bag with stands in it, mic
And down
stands,
and down those
wires.
little narrow stands, those
I
little narrow
know,
steps into the Vanguard.
unbelievable. It's anyway. I get there, I set up, and they start playing. Hey guys, luckily, I mean, I had enough time to put the mics up while they were starting to get seated. And I said, look, I don't have enough mics to give like this. Each section is going to have one mic. So if you're soloing, you have to bend over or move or get in front of that mic. They did a fantastic job because they were pros. They knew it. And they wanted it to sound good because they wanted to get a record deal. So they were about as cooperative as you can get. So I had one for each of the 3 horn sections, right? Then I had a piano mic. I had a mic for Thad Jones. And then I had a mic for the bass, which I put in the bass. And that was Richard Davis. Incredible. He had an incredible instrument, an incredible player. And I didn't even have a mic for the drums. Nothing. And because that room is so dead, it was like the universe gave me a gift. Said, okay, if you're going to do this with insufficient mics, we're going to put you in a dead room, a room full of padding, where the sound doesn't bounce off the walls at all. So you are going to get a good sound, with those mics. And it was phenomenal. The drums were right there. It was beautiful. It was almost like it was mixed for me. Because, I mean, I didn't have any pot and mic on the drums. So, the drums could have been too loud, but they weren't. They were just right. And anyway, I recorded it. And I was in ecstasy. I was going, oh my God, I have never heard big band jazz like this. This is brilliant. And there were things like he starts out with a quartet, like just a quartet. All of a sudden, the rest of the band comes in behind him, and then you know, this happens and that, and the songs and the arrangements were so great. I was just nuts. I was going nuts. And again, I got to play this on my show. They got a copy. And 5 weeks later, I was asked to come back to do more. So I came with 10 mics. This time I was smart. I said, I'll make it easy on myself. So I came with 10 mics and recorded it again. And that's what we put out a few years ago. I'm sure you're familiar with that recording. That is one of my proudest recordings. It's extremely good sounding, extremely good sounding. I couldn't be more proud of that. It jumps out at you, in explodes out of the speakers. I'm in awe of it.
It's magical music, and of course, you know, with Mel Lewis, who was, you know, kind of like the perfect big band drummer with so much recording experience.
Yeah, he was wonderful, absolutely.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the story. So as time went on, and I went through the years of my radio shows, I realized that what I really wanted was to have my own recording studio. And by then, I was quite a skilled recording, engineer. And so.
What was your major at college, George?
English and art history, which was useful. English is very useful. You can use that for writing, editing. Art history I loved because I always liked art.
So if someone had met you like at this time when you're doing all this stuff, the radio show, the live recording, and going to an Ivy League school, was it in your mind that this would be your livelihood?
Yeah.
How did you?
As I said, I wanted to be. I knew that radio station, being a DJ, was not going to work. There was no real future in that.
Right.
But there was in having a studio, because that was a good time. And actually, when I opened my studio, a year before I opened it in 69. Let's say in 68 was when they had 4-track recording, and they just were going to 8-track. So it was a very interesting time, because consoles had to be redesigned to accommodate multiple channels of playback. All sorts of things were going on at that time. So, yeah.
Just to stop there just for a moment, for folks who don't know all this stuff, you had the cylinder records back at the turn of the century. Then you have 78s from, roughly 1910 up into the mid 50s. And then we go to LP, and stereo comes in and all this kind of stuff. And then just like you're mentioning, like in the late 60s, there's kind of like an exponential growth, right? All of a sudden things start to really just open up.
Yeah.
And you're right there as it's happening.
Right.
Did you get to meet and or know and or learn from or talk to any of the great earlier engineers who just dealt with a couple of mics or with minimal mixing and
Nope.
and things like that?
Not in one of them. Nope. No. If I met any of them at all, it was later. No,
Right.
I did it on my own. I
So
never took any schooling, but I read a lot, and I had a guy who worked with me after maybe the first year, who was brilliant technician, as well as a drummer, as well as a really good recording engineer. So I had an employee that could take care of all the technical issues that I didn't understand, like, repairing equipment and so on.
What was his name?
Jeff Daking, Daking. Jeff, Geoff, Daking. Did you ever hear of a group called the Blues Magoos? It was a rock group.
I haven't.
He was the drummer, and they had disbanded. And I bought this recording console at the AES show to put in my studio, because what happened was, I ended up buying a very small studio on 48th Street and in a building off of Broadway. And as part of it, we needed to upgrade. So the guy who sold it to me was Harry Lukowski. He was a very well-known studio violinist who had contacts with lots of people, because he was often asked to book violin, and that, they were busy. This live music was happening in the recording studios all the time, and they needed strings a lot. So he was one of the string guys that and met a lot of people, and was able to bring people to the studio. So anyway, what happened was that I needed to buy a new console because of what I said. We needed new equipment. We needed to upgrade. And by the time that I was upgrading, we had 12 tracks already. We had 8 and 12 tracks. We were almost at 16 tracks. But so to do that, I needed to buy a console, so I ended up buying a console. I went to a show that it's called the engineering show each year. Found this really nice console that was very modern, very up to date, and I bought it. It was the first one they ever made, and that's really taking a chance. That company, API, is still in business. They are one of the most respected companies in the world for recording consoles. And I owned the number one, and subsequently the number three. I bought a second one for another room that I had, and so because of that, I met this guy Jeff Daking because he went to the show, and of course the console was not going to be delivered to me until the show was over, and they take it back and get it all ready for me. So he was there one day on his own, and he said to me, it said to them at the booth, "I'd like to buy this. This is great. This how much is this? Blah blah blah." And they said, "Well, if you want it, um, we'd have to make you a new one, but we've sold this to a guy named Klabin, and I'm sure that if we call him and tell him you'd like to check it out, you can come over when it's hooked up and you can hear it work." And he was okay. So he called me and he came over, and he was looking to do something. He said, "I'm looking to build my own studio." In the end, he ended up working for me. First, he was just working for me so he could
Mm-hmm.
hear the console and use it. And
Mm-hmm.
then we just stayed together for 7 years, and it was great. So that was the beginning of my recording career in an official way. It's a little studio, but in 73, I opened it in late 69. In 73, my partner, Harry Lukowski, the violinist, who was right in the middle of everything in the studios, he was working in all the studios in New York, and he would
Mm-hmm.
hear all the gossip. And he said, "Guess what? Capitol Records studio in New York is closing in a few months, or already closed. I something they closed, and the place is available. It's there's 2 floors, there's 2 rooms, one is huge. We could rent it." And it was right in the middle of the beginning of not the middle, it was at the beginning of that real estate depression in the 70s. You remember that? New York real
Mm-hmm.
estate plummeted,
Absolutely.
meaning it was going to be real hard for anyone to rent that space because it's a
Mm-hmm.
weirdo space. It's a recording studio, and it was ugly. It was great, but ugly. It needed a makeover.
Mm-hmm.
So we ended up renting it. We just took 1 floor. Later on, a couple of years later, we took the second floor, the floor below, which was the big studio. But we had a really nice studio there, and we kept the little guy for a while. So we had 2 rooms that were within walking distance. It was really great, and we fixed it all up. And Jeff Daking was prominent in the whole thing. He was so technical and so knowledgeable, and he helped me. Uh, we redid the rooms, made them look really nice, and put new equipment in, all that stuff. So now as of 73, I became Sound Ideas was the name of it, by the way. I didn't
Mm-hmm.
mention that. Sound Ideas
Mm-hmm.
became one of the major studios in New York, and I
Yes.
would say we were in the top 10 with A&R, and these are names of the time: A&R and
Mm-hmm.
Media Sound and Electric Lady and so on, Record Plant. These were and most of them did a lot of pop and a lot of non-jazz because that's where the money was. I did commercials, did some pop, of course, a lot of as much jazz as I could find, and we had a ball. It's a wonderful time.
Right. Now, what I'm fascinated about is, with James Brown and I think of
Yes,
Beethoven and
yes,
film scores and all the stuff that you guys are into, and
right,
it's the top shelf of the commercial music world.
yeah,
You are carving out time. You're doing stuff for Japanese labels. You get for Strata
yes,
East. So it seems,
yes.
what I find so like what unites your whole 50-year careers, like jazz seems to be a through line when you're in the
Oh yeah,
recording industry,
totally, totally.
and your passion for it and supporting the musicians, frankly, because a lot of these guys were getting recorded in very high quality at your studio.
As we ended up with 14 people at our peak. We had 14 people working there. Maybe half of them worked for free as what we call apprentices. They might get a job. We might give them a job, but they
Mm-hmm.
were trying out for maybe as much as a year. And a couple of them did get jobs. A couple of them were really very good and stayed with us. But I had 2 rooms. I had a manager who did the booking and all the
Mm-hmm.
financial stuff. I could
Mm-hmm.
sit there and run the place and also do engineering, which I liked, jazz engineering stuff. It was a great time.
Mm-hmm.
And studios were really hopping back then. But as we get to the end of the the 70s, I saw the writing on the wall. Two things were happening. One was my lease was going to be up. I had a 10-year lease at a very good rate on both studios. And I knew that I was going to be charged a lot more money because that recession was over. And I also knew that we couldn't keep recording the way we were. We needed something to try to get more business because the competition was a problem, because a lot of the rock groups that used to come into to all the studios were buying their own studios. Those days they had digital, the beginning of digital. It was digital, it was just around the corner. So they were just putting their own studios together. And when they recorded, they didn't need the big studios. Plus, they would charge their friends, other groups, $50 an hour. Well, $50 was something in those days, but I was charging 125 to 175 back then, which is funny because today you can book a studio for the same price or less with an engineer. That's today. We're only talking about 40 years later. So, that shows you. So I said, my manager came up with this idea. He said, George, the 3M has just built successfully the very first 32-track digital tape recorder. It records digitally on tape. And I said, so what about it? He said, well, if we brought that here, we'd be the first to have it on the East Coast. Right now, there's only one machine in existence. It's on the West Coast. And there's another guy named Tom Jung in Minnesota, and he's been developing it with them, and he has a studio. And I called him up, and we became friendly. He moved to New York, which is weird by coincidence, and started doing some work at our studio because we had the equipment he liked. In the end, I made a deal with 3M, which changed my life in other ways. But the deal was that they would supply me with one large 32-track and a 4-track, which also was a 2-track. You could mix to it. You could mix in, because there was something called quadrasonic that was still hanging around on its last legs. So they wanted to make it 4-track. That's all. So I had to buy it on a lease. It was $200,000, which is a lot of money in those days. And I was paying it off over years, and I did it. And right away, business picked up because major acts, Billy Joel, Barbra Streisand, not that they came into the studio, they either rented the equipment, or even better, they brought it back and mixed with us too sometimes. But I could rent the equipment for $1,000 a day, which ain't bad. So that's what kept me going for about a year and a half. After that, I ended up selling the studio because I was getting to the end of my lease, and I really I wanted to get out. I saw the writing on the wall, but it was, yeah.
No, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, for folks who weren't around then, the Tonight Show bands and the big TV bands left. The studio work, the network studio thing ended. And like you said, the writing was definitely on the wall, but you certainly wrote the whole thing. Let me ask you I hope you don't think it's a silly question, but since you were in on the very beginning of digital, what's your take after 50 years and 40 years and all those years?
Digital versus analog?
Analog, yeah. What's your take?
Well, I will refer you to a test that was made about 15 years ago by Mix Magazine called the Emperor's New Audio Sampling Rate or something. And what they did is they made a very precise test. They chose 50 people. They were a mixture of engineers, laymen, musicians. They tested their hearing to make sure they had good hearing. They put them in a room, and they did this with several people, not just once, and different people, totaling 50. And they would play music, and they play it again. The same exact music. They would play a section, maybe like 2 minutes, and then play it again. And they would say which one is at a higher sampling frequency. Now, what they had in those days was, instead of 44.1, they could go all the way up to 88. That's as far as they could go in those days, I think, or 96. And they said, which is which? I'm going to ask you, and then I'll tell you. What do you think was the result of that? In other words, were they able to distinguish the difference or not?
Well, you said it was the Emperor's New Clothes, so I would think that they couldn't.
That's right. 50% of them got it right, which is the same as flipping a coin. So basically, my feeling is this: working with digital is a dream. You can make the music so much better. There's so many things you can do that you couldn't do with analog, that have to do with making the performance uh, more, and not artificially. That's another thing. You can artificialize the hell out of it. I'm talking about jazz, where two guys don't start playing together, but it's a great take. What are you going to do? Another take for that? No, you just move one guy's horn slightly backwards or forwards to match the other one. You haven't changed anything they've played. You haven't done anything dishonest to the music, but you've made it sound better. And there's lots of things like that. Oh my God, infinite. Whereas with analog, you had very little you could do. You could sit there and overdub it, and if you caught it, sometimes, the guys had gone away. You couldn't even get them back. There's all sorts of issues. Does it sound better? Well, it's really good digital, really well recorded, really high quality equipment, sampling, etc. To me, sounds. I really like it. The early digital, no. The early digital was harsh. The machine that I had was probably, I didn't listen to it that often because I only had it for a year and a half and we were renting it out a lot. Was a little harsh on the high end. It had to do with what's called the actual rates they were using, the technical rates of how many samples they collected. The more samples that you can collect in the same period of time, and that means you need higher and higher quality of equipment, which has to be invented as time went on, the better the sound is going to be, the more accurate and the smoother it's going to be. It's not going to have a sort of a sharpness to it that you can feel and sort of hear, or harmonic distortion of some sort. It's very clean. It's a little bit, some people say it's a little clinical now. And some people think that the warmth, they call it the warmth of analog. What the warmth is the fact that at low frequencies, there's actually a form of distortion, which is pleasant. That is not, it's not in, it's so accurate in digital. And it's something that sounds nice. It's sort of, it's a mild saturation of the tape. So they call it distortion. And also, what that does is it's pleasant to the ear. It's not like it's not like that. It's just like a fuller sound.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to argue it. I just say whatever you like is fine. We issue analog recordings all the time, and we are, whenever possible, we actually master and put them out from analog, but often we do go to digital first, just because it's so necessary and so high. We have such high quality now. I don't think you can really tell the difference, but people will argue with me. But we work with analog a lot, and get multi-track sometimes, like I had, and so on. So I work with both. I would have to say I prefer, as I said, digital, because it's much better for the musicians. You can get a much better performance out of it. You can fix all sorts of mistakes, and I'm not talking about changing the note. I'm
I
talking about
understand.
just technical mistakes. Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So
Let me ask another question, which has to do with basic issues. So I'm going back to you in the vanguard with either Keith Jarre or with Thad and Mel,
yeah,
with a handful of microphones,
yeah.
and the perspective of the engineer.
Okay.
And again, this is like one of these
Yeah.
biblical questions.
Yeah.
Are you there to capture what they do and their balance? Or, so many famous jazz record dates and jazz recording engineers really kind of invented an artificial sound that you certainly never heard in person. Like some Blue Note records, I always thought, and they're wonderful pieces of art, I'd have to be lying on the floor with my head near the bass drum and the bass to ever hear it in that perspective. What's your
Yeah.
take on the?
Well, again, I really think that you can't capture a sound of a whole group with one mic, a stereo mic, unless you're playing in a place like the Vanguard. So even though I use 6 mics, you could have theoretically recorded that quite well. And the proof is the following. There's a record on our label, Roger Kellaway and Eddie Daniels. You know that record? Live at the Vanguard? If you don't, I can get you a copy of it.
No, yes, I
It's a
do have it.
wonderful, wonderful record. It's great musicians playing a set. Now here's how I recorded it. I wasn't hired or didn't want to record it, but I came down with my little Sony. I had a very good Sony cassette recorder that had Dolby C, which is a very high quality of noise reduction. I had their electret condenser mic, which is a little tiny stereo mic, very high quality. And I put that on the cocktail table right in the front of the band. I got seating right smack in front of the band. They were right there. And I put that on there and I turned it on and I just recorded the whole set. And I was recording it for fun, just to have it so I could listen back to it. It came out so well because, again, that's that room. It's dead as can be. And I was also getting the mix from the speakers, which helped because the bass was through the speakers, and the piano was through the speakers. And if you mix the live, which I was picking up with the speakers, which happened to be very well balanced, I got a great sound. I can't say that it's a studio sound, of course not. But there's an example where you can do it. So you're asking me a question, and the answer is it depends on the room more than anything else. Of course, it depends on other factors. But I would say when you say that about Blue Note, the problem with Blue Note recordings to me, they're very nice and crisp and pretty clear and clean, but they were done in a room that sounds like it's got brick walls. I've never even been in that room, believe it or not.
Right.
I've never visited that studio. But it was, I heard that it's very hard sound and you could hear it. The drums always sounded like they were slightly distant because of the fact that they were bouncing back into mics like the piano mic or the bass mic. And the way he recorded, I believe, was not with lots of isolation and certainly not little rooms, at least not when in the 60s. They were just all in one room. They loved it. To them, the musicians like to be able to see each other and hear each other and not worry about somebody with earphones, and so on. And I would imagine that they didn't use earphones, or that only some people used earphones. And that results in sound that is a different sound. I don't like it as much because I believe that there's little details that you're going to miss. They're going to get covered up by the bounce back of the walls, and also just muddies the sound in general slightly. So that's my take on it.
Yeah. Now, I know that you left the business for a long time.
Yeah.
And then you resurfaced and now are behind, it's just fair to say, the most outstanding, I was going to say reissue, but so many of them, they're not reissues, they're first issues.
No, we don't have any reissues. I don't think there's anything that we reissued.
Right.
We are, here's what we
are. How
are.
did it start, though?
I'll be as quick as possible. So when I got back into recording for fun was at the Vic Jazz Club in the early 2000s, 2003. I bought some equipment, some really nice equipment that I could record digitally, and I set up there with permission from the owner. Thursday nights we'd come in, and we had all kinds of great musicians, and I would record 16 tracks with that setup. And I had a lot of fun, and I even made a record there with one person, got put out. So that's the beginning of it. But that was for fun. There was no money involved, nothing. And then an opportunity came for me to purchase the house next to my house in Beverly Hills. And I said, why would I want to buy this house? And I go, because then you can have your own studio. Do you want your own studio? I said, it might be a good idea. I could record these wonderful musicians. I get myself a really good piano, and we'll make the thing real airtight. Sound, we'll put it in sound, and it became a 1.5-year project in which we ended up with this large room where we can put musicians in there, as well as a really nice control room, and all professionally soundproofed and so on. And so then I started recording performances and for fun. It's still for fun, And after I had some really good recordings, and I went to Concord and I went to a few record labels, and I said, look, these guys, listen to these great recordings. You should sign. How about signing some of these people? They're really good. These were living musicians, young musicians. One thing I know is extraordinary talent in jazz. That's my specialty. I mean, everybody can have their own taste, but I think I have a good taste of when somebody is really exceptional, virtuosic. And here's what I got back. You know what? We agree with you. This is really outstanding. We'd love to sign, but we can't do that because, we have to sell records, and that this isn't going to sell right away. And I said, no, I do understand that. And, but, don't you want something like this on your label? You've got all these famous musicians to make money. How about working with some of these people and developing their careers, and they're all like, no, we don't do that. And so I said to myself, you know what, enough of this. I'm going to start my own label. And that's how it happened. And it was 2007. I had opened this performance center studio in mid 2005, and so by 2007 I was fed up with that. So I ended up starting the label, calling it Resonance Records, and here we are, 12 years later, 13
Wow.
years later.
I've seen that room, and it's just it's intimate, and it's warm, and I can imagine what it would be like to play there. Who were some of the of all the musicians that you've recorded who were up and coming, who were not names, whether or not
Yeah.
their careers panned out in a big way or not? Who were some of your favorites of the ones that you had a hand in recording and
Okay.
fostering?
I'd just like to insert something before I answer that question. If
Sure.
any of your viewers or listeners or who are watching this particular interview would like, if you go to resonancerecords.org and you go down to the video section, just the video section, you don't have to choose an artist. All of our videos are there. We have over 200 YouTube videos. I would say 3/4 of them were shot in that room. So you can see what it looks like. You can hear the sound because they were recorded there, etc. Okay, just to let people know. Without doubt, the #1 virtuoso on violin is Christian Howes. He's way beyond anyone else that I've ever heard. And when I say this, I'm going to be, you can think I'm arrogant, whoever's listening, you have a right to disagree with me, but I've heard all the greats, all the way back to the very beginning. And it's not a long past, let's face it. Jazz violin is still relatively new in that sense, right? Doesn't even go back, before 60, 70 years, if that. Anyway,
Well, there's Joe Venuti back in the 20s, I guess.
Yeah, 20s. So it's about 100 years. I can tell you that this guy's the best I've ever heard. He is a machine of an instrument, not a bad machine. I mean, he can play anything, and he can play all kinds of styles, and he can play it brilliantly, and he's a lovely guy, and he's a teacher, and he's still relatively young. I don't know if he's hit 50 yet. And I've made 4 records with him because of all the living musicians we work with, I made the most records with him because I just love working with him. Have we sold a lot? Not a whole lot, as we expected. We've done okay with some of them, and he sells them. But right now, of course, we can't say anything about that. Right now we're in COVID time, so everything's shut down. But he's one. Then there's a wonderful singer named Polly Gibbons from England that I've worked with, made 3 records with her. She's exceptional, as good a singer as I've ever heard. And there's a young lady I'm working with now who is entered into the Sarah Vaughan Jazz Competition for this year and has already gotten accepted to the finals. And that will be held in 2021 sometime when COVID is over to the point where they can have live audiences. Her name is Tawanda, and her last name is a long name. So I just call her SJ, Tawanda SJ. It's Susbrish Joachim, the mother and the father last name she took. So Tawanda is easy to remember, Tawanda. Look for her because she is going to be the next Diane Reeves. That's how good she is. So, and then we have, of course, wonderful pianists here. I'm so sorry that in New York, if you look at the polls in Downbeat magazine every year, a lot of the West Coast musicians are completely overlooked to the point where they're not even listed at all. When you have 20 positions or 15 positions of rating on, let's say, piano, you don't see Tamir Hendelman, you don't see Josh Nelson, you don't see practically anybody from the West Coast. I think Larry Goldings is somewhere on the list, but very, very few. It's really sad. I'm really honored to work with the West Coast musicians here. They are underappreciated, shall we say.
One of the great things about Resonance, of course, is what you've done with salvaging these incredibly historic recordings. Yes. And I know, could you talk how Zev Feldman came your way?
Yeah, so I had somebody else, I won't name him. He was very disappointing, to put it mildly. Didn't want to work and got overpaid and all of that. So after a couple of years of that, I was looking for someone. And with the help of Don Lukoff, the publicist, who recommended this guy, Zev Feldman, who ended up working with him, and he's been, a revelation. And it's been a great relationship for both of us because each helps the other. And he's now the jazz detective, goes out. Things are coming to us now. We don't have to look as much. We just sit back and things come to us. We have established a quality and a reputation for that even the major labels admire. And I say this humbly, but we can actually sell a nice amount of copies of these recordings for considering the situation right now in the record business. And so here's the thing that I want to say the most. You're associating with the Jazz Museum of Harlem, right? We are a museum, even though we don't say that. What we're doing is shall we say, presenting and keeping alive the great tradition of modern jazz from bebop on. And even sometimes I think we'll end up going a little earlier, but right now, bebop on, so that even God knows when we want to continue beyond my life, and even, as long as we can. And so at some point, we would come to someone like you and say, let's say maybe I should put this in my will that you guys might, get involved with it, and take it over. If when I leave, I'm 74, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be here. So, but what I'm saying, the point I'm making is I want to keep it going. This is important for people to say, what was modern jazz like? Who are these people? And we're presenting these people in the right setting, with booklets that are very informative, photographs. We're trying to bring people back to what it was like to be there, like our Bill Evans Live at the Top of the Gate, which I recorded in 1967, I think it was. What we did when we packaged that was we got photos of the venue, because the venue had been closed for a long time. We even got a postcard was sent to us by the family of Art DeLukoff. The postcard, unbelievably, the one they would send out to people, to, hi, you remember us, or you take one there at the club when you ate dinner. It was it was a dinner club with jazz. Had Bill Evans Trio playing there. I mean, it was, what a non-coincidence. I think, whatever you want to call it. So then we made it like the story of what it was like to be there. We showed photos. We wanted to take the people back, front table, right there, listening to Bill Evans. And wherever we can do that, we try to do that, because that's a piece of history. And this Keith Jarrett recording I mentioned, if we could ever bring it out, would be a big historical recording that should come out. It's important. We'll see. So that's how we look at this. Okay. We produce beautiful products as well as the memory, as well as keeping it alive and all that. And we always have a nice EPK for people that want to know more about the specific recordings. Every single one of the recordings we've done, at least in the last 5 years, I would say, has an EPK, electronic press kit, on our website, on YouTube. You can look it up. And I do invite people to join Resonance's YouTube channel, which is almost up to 6,000 members, which I think is very good, considering, we're talking about people that really love jazz, and you're not going to join just on a whim. Obviously you got to have some interest, but there, you will be given, of course, notification when new things come out. And as also, just there's a wealth of videos on any project. If you said, what's this Sonny Rollins project? So you go on and you see 6 or 7 minute, the interviews, information about it, of course, some music from it, and you can get an idea from that. You don't have to spend any money to do that. And that's part of what a museum should be doing, is putting out like this kind of introductory material, right? Don't you agree?
Yeah, that's what we're doing, and I'm glad that you folks are doing it too.
Yes.
George Klabin, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story with us.
Warren, it's been a pleasure, and thank you for contacting me, and for what you're doing is also very important. And we're doing this together now, and that's wonderful. we'll keep it going.
Thanks for joining us for Harlem Speaks and this conversation with George Klabin. The museum offers many programs, some historical, some interviews, many on contemporary issues that intersect in many and surprising ways with jazz. My name is Lauren Schoenberg. I'm the senior scholar at the museum. You can find out more about what we offer at our website, www.jmih.org, at our Facebook page, also on our YouTube channel, where many of these interviews ultimately live. On behalf of the staff, our board, our volunteers, everyone at the museum, we want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again.